Thank you so much, Andre de Ruyter, the CEO of Eskom, for joining us. You've been at the forefront of fighting corruption at Eskom for the past 3 years. You resigned because of multiple failures and a lack of political support, but you were also poisoned with cyanide, and I felt we needed to get your testimony on record because somebody wants you dead.
When you start turning the spigots closed, then people will get upset. My rough estimate of the amount of money that gets stolen in Eskom every month is in the region of R1 billion every month. And we've made some inroads. We've definitely started closing the taps, and that doesn't make you any friends. It's difficult to speculate on who might have wanted to make an attempt on my life, but the people with motive, clearly, there's a pretty long list.
Let's start from the beginning. When you took on the job, did you have any idea of how systemic the corruption was at Eskom?
I knew, obviously, that there was corruption. I knew that it was the organization was emerging from state capture. I think, like most South Africans, I actually believed that with ZS Oak departing from Lanseria, that the era of state capture had come to an end. But what I hadn't realized was that state capture was like a cancer that was unsuccessfully treated. So it has just metastasized, and it's now grown throughout the entire body of the organization. Everywhere there is resistance to implementing controls, to conducting investigations, to implementing disciplinary action. And that realization, I think, as we've uncovered more and more and more, that has just become clearer that the rot was much worse than I anticipated when I took the job.
We talk about corruption, theft, fraud, and it seems to be not only from within, but also from the outside. So we're looking at actual cartels, which started with the coal industry, and then we're looking at saboteurs. Talk to me about the difference between the two.
We know of at least 4 organized crime cartels operating in Mpumalanga in Eskom. Some of them also have interests in Transnet, and we see that in our inability to rail coal to Majuba Power Station, for example, where we don't have enough electric locomotives because the overhead lines are stolen, and Transnet doesn't have enough diesel locomotives because these are being tampered with and otherwise disabled. So these 4 cartels are quite sophisticated as far as we can tell. They are well organized. It's interesting that they've adopted the language of the mafia, so people are called soldiers, and they have a hit squad, allegedly between 60 and 70 highly trained, well-armed people, and people get assassinated in Mpumalanga. I think the media maybe has become very used to these reports, so it doesn't receive much airtime anymore, but every week there's pretty much an assassination. So it's deeply entrenched, and it is highly organized. Now, also understand that there are many hangers-on. So if there is a contractor who gets paid a pittance to do cleaning or whatever the case may be, to pay someone like that 5,000 Rand to walk past a gearbox with a screwdriver and just with a sharp jab knock out the sight glass where you can check the oil level. The gearbox oil then drains and the gearbox fails, and somebody who's got a maintenance contract is then called out. But the individual who committed the act of sabotage, because that's what it is not the kingpin. That's just one of the runners.
Soldier, yeah.
And that is where I think we have a systemic problem, is that it's really so simple. And you can't post a policeman over every employee's shoulder to watch what they're doing. At a certain point in time, you have to trust them. The measures that we've implemented, we've implemented high definition intelligent cameras. So these cameras use artificial intelligence to recognize behaviors. If somebody's loitering in a certain area where he shouldn't be, or if he's smoking, or whatever you want to alert the AI program to, then an alarm goes off. And what we found is that whenever these cameras break down, then of course there's a spate of incidents. So these things are very well organized, very well coordinated.
You were saying that there's a well-known nexus between, or connection between theft, sabotage, procurement irregularities, and politics, both national and local.
There's very little explanation for the very vociferous opposition to just starting the just energy transition, just starting the decarbonization of the South African economy, which is an essential part of protecting our environment, growing our economy, addressing energy security, creating employment. Why else would you so absolutely resist even the commencement of the transition? And I raised this question to one of my colleagues, who's a very wise woman, and she compliments my white Afrikaans blind spots very well. And she says, but Andre, you are naive. You are not showing the comrades a way to eat. And that was a very telling comment, and I think that is the explanation, that there are so many vested interests in the coal value chain that the threat of decarbonization, even though we're talking about a multi-decade move, gradual, very gradual move away from coal, why that is so eagerly opposed and with such vehemence.
The so-called just transition from coal to renewables in SA has been taking a long time. There's no updated IRP. Why the hesitance? Why the constant stalling?
This is also mystifying to me, because if I look at the facts, I look at the fact that you can solve energy security in the shortest possible time. The quickest energy that we can today deploy is wind and solar. We can remove the obstacles to growth, so the economy can recover. 56% of South Africa's exports are at risk of the so-called CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or essentially just a carbon border tax. Now, this is pretty existential, and I've had calls from large manufacturers and large minerals processors desperately asking me, do you have green energy available? Because we are going to lose market share if we don't start now. And the lack of response from government, frankly, I find rather puzzling in the face of such a huge risk to our export industries. Then you look at the environment. 29,000 people die prematurely every year due to ambient air pollution.
I didn't know.
And we are somehow okay with it. Personally, I've got a big issue with that. And I think we need to address it, and we need to address it urgently. We consume an extraordinary amount of water at Eskom. If we implement our plan to retire 22 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity, that's about 47% of our installed capacity, by 2035. So that's more than a decade away. We will release back into the Vaal River system about 40 billion litres per annum. Now, what does that look like? That's enough water to provide 220 litres of water per day to 200 million people. That's more than 3 times the population of South Africa. Now, if you look at what Professor Francois Engelbrecht at Wits said, he said that there's a mega drought coming, brace yourself, it's going to hit us, we're going to have another El Nino, and it's going to be a multi-year event. Isn't this something that we should address in order to improve our climate resilience as a country? And the funding is available, and it is highly concessional. It is extraordinarily generous. So, it's difficult, having thought about this very long and hard for the past 3 years, to see why one would not do this unless improperly incentivized.
You said, according to your estimation, about 1 billion rand goes missing from Eskom every month. Mm-hmm. Where is this money going to?
It's going into very conspicuous consumption. So our informants tell us that there are people who, when they have a gathering and they walk into the room, they wash their hands in 15-year-old whiskey. Why? Because they can. There's apparently a car dealer in one of the Mpumalanga Highveld towns where you can park your Maserati or your McLaren, and if you feel like driving it, then you order it, it gets delivered, you drive it through the potholed streets of Emalahleni. I don't know how you do that, but nonetheless. And the reason why it's done in that way is that if you register the car in your name, then obviously a lifestyle audit will pick it up. So this particular car dealer renders a very innovative service. You look at the number of Louis Vuitton bags. Now, I've got nothing against Louis Vuitton, but if you just think about the disposable income that certain individuals have, and you look at how they decked out from top to toe, then you start asking questions. So, and this is pretty well known. We've seen Eskom buyers parading on Facebook with all of their finery, and when we've investigated, indeed, it turns out that they are corrupt. So there's no shame or attempt to hide it.
Is there a link in those cases to local politicians?
I would say that the extent to which this is known about, and if not condoned, at least it's left alone. And that suggests to me that there are politicians who by knowing, are complicit. If you look at a town like Standerton, there's a very well-organized racket operating there that feeds off the Tutuka power station. So breakages are engineered. And that's also the station, by the way, where the plant manager walks around with a bulletproof vest and is accompanied by armed guards to do his job. Now, somehow we have started to accept that this situation is normal, whereas clearly it's not.
My next question is, where has state security been, where have the police been, and where has the SANDF been when you've been calling for their support, and suddenly we have the army moving in once you announce your resignation? What's been their response prior to this?
Crickets, really nothing at all. In fact, when we have managed to make arrests, in one instance we managed to effect the arrest of a buyer who had bought on behalf of Eskom knee guards, which you use when you have to kneel to do welding or whatever the case may be. Now, these things cost about 320 Rand a pair at Builder's Warehouse. We paid 80,000 Rand each. So the arrest was effected. I insisted that we had the equivalent of a perp walk at the power station.
To make an example of...
Exactly, to demonstrate that we were taking crime seriously. But the following day, the individual was released, no charges, on the instructions of a senior police officer. Now, you have to say, how is this possible? So I think it's fair to say that the response of the South African police hitherto has been disappointing. We have shared some of the intelligence that we've gathered with select officers. I don't particularly want to talk about that too much because I don't want to compromise their investigation, which is not really that popular internally. But I think also if you look at state security, I mean, this is an existential threat to the state. And my non-legal definition of treason is if you take money to do something that is to the detriment of the state. So there are acts of treason going on a daily basis in Mpumalanga, and state security are just missing in action. They did see fit, however, to send one of their agents to COP27 to keep an eye on me. When one of my friends asked him what he was doing there, he said, no, just keeping an eye on the big guy. So clearly I'm under suspicion of treasonous activity, but the real culprits can act with impunity. Now, I don't know. These things are Kafkaesque.
That's a very good way of describing it. And then you yourself are accused by a minister of treason, and nobody, including the president, comes to your defense.
Yeah, this was quite an extraordinary event. When Minister Mantashe made the statement at the signing ceremony of an IPP contract, one of my colleagues who was there representing Eskom sent me a WhatsApp and he said, I'm not sure if I heard this correctly because it's so outrageous, he can't believe his ears. And then he verified it with a journalist, and then subsequently the journalist went to the minister and said, is this a responsible thing to say? And the minister said, yeah, we believe that Eskom are subverting the state by load shedding.
To take the ANC out of power,
yes.
Ostensibly.
Well, which is also slightly problematic because you're conflating the state with the party.
Of course.
And there should be a nice separation between the two.
Interestingly enough, a journalist several years ago said to Gwede Mantashe, the Minister of Minerals and Energy, one day you'll be called the Minister of Load Shedding. And he said, oh no, that won't be me. I'll blame Minister Pravin Gordhan. He'll be called the Minister of Load Shedding. Did you have any contact with Gwede Mantashe after he'd made that comment? Was there any discussion between the two of you? That's a very serious allegation to make.
No one-on-one discussion. He did attend a number of meetings where I was also involved in. Ironically, on the day that I got poisoned, just before I had the famous cup of coffee, there was a meeting with the president and a number of cabinet ministers, but no one-on-one discussion. So no, we've generally tried to avoid one another's company.
And no apology from anyone in cabinet?
No. I think that would be very optimistic to expect that.
Why did you resign?
I think it was the culmination of a series of factors. The first very important factor was the dismissal of the previous board en masse. There was one director, Dr. Rod Crompton, who had remained to preserve ostensibly continuity. But if you look at the private sector, when you rotate directors in and out, you typically do it up to a third of the board at a time in order to preserve institutional memory. And when I met the new board and it became clear to me that I was going to go back 3 years and start again, this was a daunting prospect and quite exhausting to just think about. Then there was the statement made by Deputy Minister Zizi Kodwa that the SSA had been engaging with me since June to obtain certain documents that would allow them to vet me. That is just not true. The first time that I had been engaged or approached by SSA for vetting, now bear in mind this is after I'd been in the job for just about 3 years, was in October of 2022. So why the sudden urgency to now find out how it could possibly be compromised? Again, you can speculate about that.
Do you know why?
No, look, my trust levels, frankly, in SSA are fairly low. And all I can think is that they wanted to equip themselves with information that would be handy to them in running various intelligence campaigns. You know, when the bug, the famous bug, was found in my car.
Just explain to our viewers about that, because some of them may not know about it.
Yeah, so a listening device, a listening and tracking device, was found in my car. I sent a picture of this to an expert forensic investigator. He immediately told me, this is problematic, I need to have it investigated. They then collected it from me. They had it analyzed by a forensic investigator who specializes in electronic eavesdropping. There was a very comprehensive report that indicated that this was a listening device and tracking device that was found in my car.
Available, the kind of device that would be available to the common man, or something that was a little more sophisticated?
No, so this is where it gets quite interesting. So when I spoke to someone that I know in the Inspectorate General of Intelligence, the individual told me, of course I recognize this. This is one of ours. We have lots of these.
Is there anything particular that you think you implemented that caused the kind of pushback that you started experiencing around about that time?
Look, we had cancelled a number of corrupt contracts. At Tutuka Power Station, again, we stopped the theft of 100 million rand per month of fuel oil. Again, we identified 2 individuals. We handed them over to the police. They were released the following morning on, frankly, derisory bail of 500 rand. So that's where the matter ended. We also had repeated attempts by fuel oil suppliers to resurrect some of these corrupt contracts. Famously, there was a meeting where the Eskom procurement team wanted the generation board to sign off on the award of a contract to the tune of 432 million rand to a one-man closed corporation operating out of a suburban home in Germiston. This particular gentleman had a judgment for bad debt on his house, and he had his car repossessed at one stage, and he had no infrastructure, no knowledge of the fuel oil industry. And when I made inquiries from the procurement team why they were recommending this, they could not provide a satisfactory explanation. So the attempts kept on coming and coming and coming. Whenever we try to implement controls to prevent coal theft, to prevent poor quality coal being delivered, again and again we drew the net tighter, imperfectly, because we're operating against some very determined individuals. But I think that people were not pleased with that. That is quite clear.
What was the response from high-level members of government and the NPA when you approached them with evidence of corruption?
We had significant difficulty in energizing senior levels of the police. We had one meeting at Megawatt Park with senior officers of the police right at the highest level, as well as SSA representatives, where we shared chapter and verse what we'd found, obviously in a way that protected our sources. The generals and the SSA colleagues were suitably aghast and said, you know, this is completely unacceptable. Of course, we'll immediately start acting on this, and then nothing happened. Now, again, you start to question, is this just incompetence, or is there an attempt to somehow sweep things under the carpet?
Have you approached the president or any of the ministers about your concerns regarding high levels of irregularities, theft, corruption, sinister goings-on at Eskom?
Absolutely. I shared the information with a minister. I think I shouldn't mention names, but I did share it, and as well as with senior advisors to the president himself. I never informed the president personally, but I certainly gave the message through, which, by the way, I'm obliged by law to do.
Is Eskom a feeding trough, if you like, for the ANC?
I would say the evidence suggests that it is. I expressed my concern to a senior government minister about attempts, in my view, to water down governance around the $8.5 billion that, by and large, through Eskom's intervention, we got at COP26. And the response was essentially, you have to be pragmatic. You have to, in order to pursue the greater good, you have to enable some people to eat a little bit. So yes, it is, I think, entrenched.
Andre, when you did approach the minister, a minister, about your concerns about sinister and criminal goings-on at Eskom, what was the response like?
So when we pointed out that there was one particular high-level politician that was involved in this, the minister in question looked at a senior official and said, I guess it was inevitable that it would come out anyway, which suggests that this wasn't news.
And is this high-level politician still acting as a politician, as a member of parliament, or?
Indeed.
Is he or she in cabinet?
Yeah, let's not go there.
All right.
Because of the risk.
Talking about libel, yeah. Just to go to the actual poisoning incident, talk me through that morning.
Yeah, so it was a very interesting day. On the 12th of December, which was a Monday morning, I met with Mpho Makwana, the chairman of the board, at the Dainfern Clubhouse, and he wanted to do my performance appraisal with me, and I said maybe this obviates that discussion, and I slid my letter of resignation across the table to him. We then had discussions about how long and when and so forth. Then we both went to Megawatt Park. I had the meeting with online meeting with the president, number of ministers, and then I asked my PA for a cup of coffee. She knows I'm a caffeine addict, so she keeps them coming.
What kind of coffee do you drink? Does it come out of a machine, or
yes.
is it instant, or you?
So the machine that morning was being serviced. It had broken,
Okay.
And there were people trying to fix it. So she left my mug, and it's a mug. So this is a recommendation, a learning that I can share. Never have a personalized mug. It's a bad idea. So
I knew it was personalized. We were talking about it before the interview. It was definitely personalized.
with a nice Afrikaans, early Afrikaans slogan on it. Then she left the mug, my PA Zodwa. She left the mug there at the coffee machine unattended, and came and told me that the machine was broken and could she make me instant coffee. By the time that she got back, the machine had been repaired and a coffee was then presented to me. I then drank this coffee and didn't notice anything amiss.
Did it taste the same as usual?
I detected nothing. The only thing that but you don't even think about these things, was that the consistency of the foam was a bit different to normal, but I thought nothing of it. And then about 15, 20 minutes after this cup of coffee, I started feeling extremely nauseous and off balance. I became very confused. I was sitting opposite a colleague and I couldn't find the word for a power station. I said it's a filling station, it's a petrol station, but for the life of me, I couldn't find the word for a power station. And I also started to yawn, lack of oxygen. I started gasping for air. I was panting. And then I said, no, there's something wrong here. I need to get to a doctor quickly. But eventually I went to my GP.
Who took you there?
My security, so they rushed me there. And I got examined by the doctor. He quickly ruled out heart attack, hypoglycemia, and then he said, okay, we're going to put you on one of our beds in our day clinic. Then when the blood samples were being taken, I called the doctor over and I said, let's do a tox screen as well, because there's something wrong here. This is not right. I'm not supposed to feel this way.
So you came up with the idea that you could have been poisoned.
Yes. At that stage, I was shaking badly. I was literally lying like this and shaking, gasping for air. So the doctor was running up and down, and one of his colleagues called him over and said, what's wrong with that guy? And he said, well, we don't know. We're running tests. And his colleague told him, I've seen this before. This is cyanide poisoning. Sorry if this gets a bit too graphic, but then I vomited very, very copiously, which was a good thing. I was also put on a drip with jet fuel. Now, jet fuel is just very high vitamin B. And I think inadvertently, the doctor who prescribed this probably saved my life by doing that, because vitamin B binds with the cyanide molecule. And that very high dosage administered so quickly helped to, I think, absorb some of the cyanide. Yeah, so then the doctor said, okay, your cyanide levels are somewhat elevated. You need to come back for a further test. I went back for a further test. The test took quite some time to complete for whatever reason. I think it was the festive season. And then it turned out that my cyanide levels were indeed significantly elevated. Then when it became apparent that the story would break, I laid a charge of attempted murder at the police, and that's how the story went.
Could you have died?
I have subsequently consulted a specialist toxicologist, and the theory is that this was not a pure cyanide cocktail, but that it was a mixture of cyanide and sodium arsenite, which is a rat poison. And what the sodium arsenite apparently does is it masks the detectability of cyanide in a blood test. So if that is so, then the real level of cyanide that I ingested was probably higher than indicated by the blood test. So look, it's difficult to speculate. I had cyanide, I survived it. Could I have died? Probably.
Do you have any idea of who who poisoned you?
No idea whatsoever. One of the individuals who was responsible for taking care of the coffee machine has since absconded from work. He's disappeared. So that remains to be investigated. I was approached to make a statement by two middle-aged detective sergeants. Now, with all due respect, if you are middle-aged and still a sergeant in the police, then you haven't really shot the lights out career-wise. Okay. And as we went through the statement, I mentioned that my cyanide levels were elevated, as indicated by the blood tests. And the detective sergeant then inquired whether I had been experiencing problems with my sinuses. I then asked whether they knew what cyanide was. And they said, no, this is a technical medical term. They don't know anything about it. The doctor needs to explain it to them, and they'd never seen it in their lives before. Now, either this is monumental incompetence by the police, or they are just not interested in investigating this.
So a high-level delegation from the Hawks did not immediately arrive at the office or the hospital or at your home?
This is actually an attack on the state. If your head of your national utility is poisoned, that's a pretty serious matter.
It's an assassination.
And it ran in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. It was reported in the Netherlands, in Germany. So this is not a trivial matter, certainly not as far as investors think. But the best that the South African police could do was to dispatch 2 of their finest detective sergeants to come and take my statement.
Yeah. Just moving on to Eskom now, the utility. Are the problems intractable? Can Eskom be fixed?
Eskom in its current state cannot be returned to its former glory. And I think this is something that South Africans must realize, and in particular politicians must realize. Once you have so badly neglected mechanical equipment that it's falling apart, once you have allowed your skills base to be eroded to the point where people are no longer following basic principles of good operating practice, to turn that around becomes an enormous challenge. And certainly I think it is not feasible to do it. And I don't think it's necessary to do it. I think if you look at what is available right now in terms of the latest technologies, from a cost competitiveness point of view, if you look at the significant appetite of the private sector to invest in generation, it is clear that Eskom over time is going to morph into a transmission and a distribution company which offers facilities for the private sector to connect to the grid. Now, Eskom will be in generation for many years to come. Kusile's last unit is scheduled to shut down in 2071. So that's a long time from now. So to create false alarm that somehow the changes in Eskom are an attack on coal is simply not justified by the facts. But if we do not start now, we will not recover.
What does that look like?
So I always say we find ourselves in the present predicament because in the past we spent inadequate time talking about the future. Bearing in mind that in 1998, Eskom warned the government and said, we need more capacity. You need to build more power stations. Nothing was done until 2007, when belatedly Medupi and Kusile was started, fraught, beautiful word in both Afrikaans and English, fraught with corruption. And that still is hugely problematic for us in terms of design defects that are the direct result of the corrupt award of the boiler contract. And we're still battling with that. The problem is when you allow politicians with a 2 or 3 year cycle to start making decisions about 20-year infrastructure decisions. They're simply not interested. They want what will win them the next election, not what will keep the country going for the next 2 decades. And that balance, I think, has been disturbed by turning Eskom into a state-owned entity under the direct control of the Department of Public Enterprises, who has played a very interventionist role, micromanagement even, of Eskom. There's a narrative that the state should control everything. Unfortunately, the ghosts of Marx and Lenin still haunt the halls of Luthuli House. People are still firmly committed to a 1980s style ideology. They still address one another as comrade, which is frankly embarrassing. They They use words like lumpen proletariat, which is ridiculous because, these things were last said in 1980s East Germany. And when such individuals talk to foreign diplomats and foreign investors, the bemusement, the puzzlement with which they leave those meetings really creates a big problem for South Africa's credibility, because people say, well, we haven't heard this language since the fall of the Berlin Wall. What do these people think?
Right. In terms of short-term measures that government can introduce in order to increase capacity before 2024 elections, what do you think that they're likely to do to try and bring down load shedding?
There's a lot of capacity in the pipeline. But I think because we've waited so long, 2023, unfortunately, is going to be a tough year as far as load shedding is concerned.
How tough?
Stage 6 during winter, highly probable, maybe worse.
What does worse look like?
More load shedding for longer.
Gosh. What does a total collapse of the grid look like?
So total collapse of the grid is when the frequency of the grid goes from 50 hertz to 48, 47, 46 hertz and below. So the frequency of the grid is like the heartbeat. If that frequency is lost, we will then have to restart with great effort using certain black start facilities, our pumped hydro storage schemes, and working very closely with some of our key customers to essentially kickstart the entire system. And this will take 2-3 weeks to do. Now, in the 1970s, there was a total blackout in New York, and I think it lasted for 18 hours. And during that period, there was widespread looting. Crime got completely out of control. Now, that's the one data point that we've got of the sort of societal disruption that you could see if there's a total system blackout. Okay, that's the bad outcome that we want to avoid. So we have really fantastic people working in our national control system. So I think the risk is very low because we have good people and because we have the tool of load shedding that we can implement. But of course, load shedding causes damage to the economy. So this is what we want to try and avoid. But if you keep the lights on at all cost, as we did for many years, you just postpone the day of darkness, and it just becomes worse and worse and worse. I don't want to speculate too much or alarm people too much. But if you look at, again, the reasons for this, we lost 3 units at Kusile due to the collapse of a flue duct. There was carryover from the flue gas desulfurization unit because the exhaust gas temperature from the boiler supplied by Hitachi is too high. And as we know, Hitachi
yes,
was in a joint venture with Chancellor House, the investment arm of the ANC, and as will become apparent in the near future, there was substantial manipulation of design criteria in order to ensure that Hitachi got that tender. But fact of the matter is, if the contract had initially been awarded correctly, without corruption, we would not have had the severity of load shedding that we have right now. So corruption is the gift that just can't stop giving.
Just talking about emergency decisions that are taken, emergency always is a red flag for me because it opens the door for corruption. Car Powership, that procurement program was during COVID and was declared an emergency to keep enough electricity on to keep people being able to breathe on ventilators. What are your thoughts on that particular tender?
So first of all, if we look at the company concerned, If you do a fairly perfunctory search on Cartels, it is quite clear that there's an extensive legacy of alleged corruption, breaches of contract, and abuse that they have left in their lurch in the countries where they've operated. So I think one's got to be careful with whom you get into bed on these particular deals. The second thing is the term of the contract. To my mind, and I've been involved in large capital projects now for more than 30 years, there's absolutely no justification for concluding a 20-year agreement with a company that can raise the anchor, literally, and sail away with the asset that the country has paid for. If it's truly required for 20 years, why not build it on land, where it becomes part of South Africa's asset base, instead of sailing away off into the sunset? The third thing that concerns me is the amount of resistance to enhanced anti-bribery and corruption clauses that I experienced. I remember sitting in a meeting one evening on Teams with the legal advisor and other representatives of the Independent Power Producer Office, which of course reports into DMRE. And I laid out some language on what we should have as an enhanced anti-bribery and corruption clause. And the resistance was just inexplicable. Why would anybody not want to support enhanced anti-corruption measures? And then when it came to signing the contract, the Eskom position was very simple. It's a very litigious contract. We're happy to sign it, not really, but that was what we said, happy to sign it, but given the litigious nature of this, please just give us an indemnity. Now, if I buy a car from you and I ask you to indemnify me against the consequences of that car had ever been used in committing a crime, then you'd probably say, okay, you know, if that floats your boat, then do it.
Sure.
In this instance, that indemnity has not been forthcoming.
The Russians and Chinese have made themselves very visible recently, and our cooperation with them has been widely reported, which is somewhat controversial, especially now as Russia is looking for friends concerning the war with Ukraine. Do you think they've got any role to play or are playing any part in selling us oil or anything nuclear on the cards?
Now we go into the realm of speculation. Again, no evidence. About 3 months ago, there was a visit by the Russian Minister of Energy to South Africa. Russia, as we know, is very long on natural gas, following its invasion of Ukraine. It is looking for markets for gas, there's no doubt about that. It was quite interesting for me to observe how soon after that we received a request from the Central Energy Fund to transfer 3 of our aging power stations, Camden, Hendrina and Grootvlei, to the Central Energy Fund, which by the way reports into the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, to convert those to gas. Now, maybe I'm adding 1 and 1 and getting 3, but in politics there is very seldom such a thing as a coincidence.
Let's move forward. What are you going to do now?
The first thing I'm going to do is to take a holiday. Want to spend some time with my family, particularly my children, see if we can again reconnect after 3 years where I've been largely absent. And then we'll see. There are many opportunities. I think that I'm fortunately in a position where I can hopefully continue to make a contribution to combating climate change. It's something that I feel very strongly about. It's important that we do what we can to leave a livable planet to our children. And if I can contribute to that, then that's what I want to do.
What would you say to the next Eskom CEO?
Don't have a personalized mug.
I'm glad your sense of humour is still intact. Are you afraid that you could be murdered for speaking out?
I intend to spend a bit of time abroad after I finish my stint at Eskom. I think that would be good for my health.
Keep a low profile.
Yeah.
Well, I certainly hope that you live to tell the tale. And I think you went in with this, as I've understood it, as country duty. You honestly felt that you could make a difference. You tried. Do you think you failed?
I think I failed in terms of the readily measurable objectives, load shedding. That's the big elephant in the room. But if I look at the way in which we've defined a strategy, which I believe is now irrevocably set, that we are going to start the just energy transition, how we have been able to address some key issues on the balance sheet. From an income statement perspective, I think the income statement is looking a lot better than it did. Governance is much improved. I think the organization is in a better space from a compliance point of view than it had been. We are irrevocably committed to unbundling and restructuring in spite of the signal lack of cooperation from the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy.
3 years ago, if you'd known about this, would you have taken the job on?
Probably not. Do I regret it? No. I think it's been a real honor to serve South Africa. I've met some absolutely brilliant people from all walks of life. I've been able to hopefully make a little bit of a difference in setting South Africa's agenda when it comes to our power system, our environment and climate change. And it's been quite a ride.
Thank you so much, Andre de Ruyter, for joining us and being so frank in our discussion. It's certainly been not only riveting, but shocking and disappointing to hear what is going on at the coalface. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thanks, Annika.